Introduction of bills.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Duncan.
Recognize the Minister of Economic Investments Corporation.
Mr. Speaker, I move that Bill number 151, the Sask Energy Carbon Tax Fairness for Families Amendment Act 2023, be now introduced and read a first time.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 151 be now introduced and read a first time. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First reading of this bill.
When shall the bill be read a second time? I recognize the Minister.
Next sitting of the Assembly.
Next sitting. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Orders of the day.
75-minute debate. Mr. Domitar.
Cut knife, turtle third.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honored to enter into today's debate. Unfortunately, here we are again discussing how the federal government has impeded nearly every sector of our growing economy. The national carbon tax was implemented on April 1, 2019 at $20 per tonne and was supposed to only increase each year by $10 per tonne until 2022, when it was supposed to max out at $50. However, since then, we've seen the federal government increase it from the $50 per tonne to $65 per tonne in 2023, with plans to increase it to $170 per tonne by 2030. Since 1988, the Government of Canada has had at least a dozen climate plans, including the Kyoto Protocol, Copenhagen Accord, and the Paris Agreement. Yet the federal government has never imposed climate change management strategies with scope, scale, and speed it has since 2015. That is why it is being said that the plan is always ever-changing. The current federal government has launched over 2,500 unique climate initiatives, introduced and changed Canada's carbon tax 6 times in as many years, and they have revised the national greenhouse gas emissions targets 7 times since 2015. The federal government policies are costing Saskatchewan's natural resource sector investment and jobs. The federal government's constant changing of climate policies really do limit opportunities to move forward. Saskatchewan has the resources that drive innovation, fuel growth, and improve a better way of life. The pursuing of a climate agenda is being pushed by the federal government with very little knowledge or understanding of its impact, moving forward without thought or minimal input from provinces, and having this ideology, the one-size-fits-all approach that only works for a few Canadians. Every single day, affordability comes up here in this House. It is due to the federal climate policies which are causing undue hardship on families, businesses, and entire sectors of the economy that is being stifled to achieve limited or very marginal progress in addressing climate change. The province of Saskatchewan has shown it is possible to achieve both economic and environmental goals in unison, most recently reducing greenhouse emissions from venting and flaring at upstream oil facilities by 65% below 2015 levels, while increasing production. The constant shifting of policies and targets continues to hamper competitiveness, discourage investment, limit trade, and therefore reduces employment opportunities and harms the Saskatchewan way of life. Canada's Parliamentary Budget Officer expects the clean fuel regulations alone will cost the average Saskatchewan household an extra $1,117 in 2030. This supports the Saskatchewan White Paper drawing the line, which indicated that Saskatchewan's economy would suffer by over $100 billion in 2035. Just days before the Energy and Minerals Minister Conference, the federal government shared several hundred pages of material, fully knowing that provinces would not have the time to review and analyze the material before weighing in on Canada's energy and resource future. Just another example of how the federal government impedes our province's economic growth. Recent research done suggests that carbon taxes and pricing systems do not significantly reduce emissions. The University of Toronto research has shown that aggregate reductions from carbon pricing on emissions are limited to between 0 and 2%. For comparison, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states that global net human-caused carbon dioxide emissions must fall by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 to limit global warming by only 1.5 degrees Celsius, reaching net zero around 2050. Our government is very proud of this province and the efforts that have been made thus far to build climate resistance and pursue sustainable growth. Local farmers have sequestered 12.8 million tonnes of carbon through zero-till practices in 2020, more than any other Canadian province, and the same is taking 2.78 million cars off the road. SaskPower's Boundary Dam has captured 4.6 million tonnes of CO2 since it opened, about the same as planting over 69 million trees and letting them grow for over 10 years. And Saskatchewan's pulse producers captured 2.15 million tonnes of carbon in 2021, equivalent to taking 467,000 cars off the road. The federal government has further complicated matters by setting targets without the full understanding of the outcomes of existing policies. Emissions data normally takes years to develop and are notorious for frequent revisions. This data deficiency has led the federal government to revise its greenhouse emissions and move the goalposts 7 times over the last 9 years. The clean fuel regulations that began on July 1, 2023 has already increased costs for consumers and has negatively impacted Saskatchewan's competitiveness, particularly in the agriculture, mining, forestry, oil and gas, and transportation sector. At this time, up to $3 billion in Saskatchewan investments are at risk to relocating. Our government is awaiting an announcement on the Natural Resources Canada engagement that occurred from May to July of 2023. The United States Inflation Reduction Act, which introduced a clean fuels production credit, makes biofuels production in the United States very attractive and will essentially pull investments away from building domestic supply right here in Canada. Another example of the federal government moving forward without consideration of the supply-demand issues as well as the impact of inflation. The Canadian Fuel Regulation Standard Federal Regulatory Impact Assessment admits that rural households will be more heavily impacted unless choices are made to either switch personal vehicles over to electric vehicles or to just simply not drive as much. Mr. Speaker, this just does not work for the people of our province that live in rural areas. Bill C-69, the Impact Assessment Act, sets out a complex framework for designating certain projects for review, analyzing their adverse effects on areas in federal jurisdiction, and weighing mitigation measures and sustainability concerns. The law grew out of a major campaign promise from the Liberals in the 2015 election and has produced heated controversy ever since. Catherine McKenna, the then Environment Minister, said at that time that better rules would protect the environment while improving investor confidence and making the Canadian energy and resource sector more competitive. However, this has not gone on according to the Liberal plan. The government's own energy fact book says that capital expenditures in the energy sector dropped 44% between 2014 and 2021. It has been said that this has contributed to the slow bleed of Canada. This legislation is also responsible for the financial loss of tens of billions in investment, as well as thousands of jobs across many provinces and ultimately economic sectors. Westerners, Mr. Speaker, have found themselves increasingly under a sustained attack from Ottawa, resulting in a sure of separatist rhetoric that had been dormant for over 40 years. Ironically, so since the days of Pierre Trudeau's National Energy Program. In the ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada on Friday, October 13th, 5 out of 7 judges said the Impact Assessment Act is largely unconstitutional because it seeks to regulate activities that fall within provincial jurisdiction. The court ruling will make a very real difference for projects that are being proposed within the boundaries of one province. However, transmission lines or pipelines will still be subject to federal assessment. Bill C-69 has basically a bunch of subjective standards that made it almost impossible for a certain kind of project to be approved. A report from the Canada West Foundation, published earlier this year, found that out of the 25 projects submitted under the Federal Impact Assessment Act since 2019, almost all remain in the first two phases of a four-part approvals process. How does any of this help Saskatchewan's economy, Mr. Speaker? In July of 2022, the Government of Canada released a discussion paper detailing plans for emissions from the oil and gas sector to be capped at current levels and decline at a pace to reach net zero by 2050. Similar requirements are not planned for other industry sectors. Again, one resource sector in Canada is being carved out and essentially being treated differently than another. Pending the design, the oil and gas sector emissions cap may effectively act as a limit on oil and gas production within Canada. An outline of the design was expected from the federal government in early 2023, and all we've heard so far is crickets. It's now expected to be released in late 2023. Today, mid-November, and absolutely still nothing. Saskatchewan did provide feedback on the options to cap and cut oil and gas sector greenhouse gas emissions to achieve 2030 goals that was released in July of 2022. This document proposed regulatory options to achieve a net zero target of 2050, but was silent on the costs to industry. The federal government is considering two regulatory options. First, a new cap and trade system under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999, which would require the establishment and administration of a completely new system. Second, a modification of the carbon pricing regime under the Greenhouse Gas Pollutions Pricing Act, which involves creating a higher sector-specific carbon price for oil and gas. Oil and gas emissions in Saskatchewan, as reported to the United Nations by the Government of Canada, indicated that emissions have been on a distinct downward trend since 2015. Nationally, oil and gas sector emissions have continued to increase. I think this simply means that globally there is much to be learned. As it has been stated before in this House by our Premier, if more countries sequestered oil, as we do here in Saskatchewan, there would be a 25% reduction in total emissions. Currently, the 2023 estimate for oil production is 456,700 barrels per day. The current combined estimate for 2023 value of oil and gas production is $13.1 billion. There are also approximately 180 companies that currently operate actively producing oil and gas wells in Saskatchewan. Oil and gas are significant economic boosters and needs to not only grow but be protected from infringement by our federal Liberal-NDP coalition government. When it comes to the fertilizer emissions cap, Mr. Speaker, the goal is for farmers across the country to reduce emissions that come from synthetic fertilizers by 30% by 2030 from the 2020 levels. Mr. Speaker, farming generates about 8% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gases come from a variety of sources. Diesel and gas-powered machinery is used to till fields, plant seeds, apply fertilizers, harvest crops, and transport the food to market. Again, Canadian farmers are already among the most sustainable growers in the world. They have less room to lower fertilizer emissions without compromising food production than those in other countries. As we all know, there are only 8 growing seasons until 2030, and these targets are ridiculous when you consider that we export most of our grain products that helps feed the world. It's a shame that the federal government doesn't recognize and credit us for the carbon capture that our farmers have been sequestering for the last 40 years with their no-till practices, simply because they were way ahead of their time with their forward thinking in reducing greenhouse gas emissions before our federal government even thought it was a concern. Mr. Speaker, the bottom line is this. It doesn't matter if it is the federal carbon tax, the Clean Fuel Standard, Bill C-69, the oil production cap, the clean electricity standard, or the fertilizer emissions cap. There are significant impacts to every single one of us. It doesn't matter if you are simply a consumer who likes to light and heat your home, or you are a farmer trying to feed the people of Saskatchewan and export feed to the rest of the world, or you are even just a person extracting the oil from the ground. Each one of us is impacted by these stacking regulations. In speaking to affordability issues, the challenge has just begun, and it will continue to get more difficult for families if the federal government continues to dampen the economic success of this province. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'll move the following motion: that this Assembly demands the Liberal-NDP coalition of the Government of Canada end policies that would constitute an attack on Saskatchewan's economic growth and energy production, including but not limited to the federal carbon tax, the Clean Fuel Standard, Bill C-69, the oil production cap, the clean electricity standard, and the fertilizer emissions cap. And further, that this Assembly denounces the Saskatchewan New Democratic Party for their support of these policies. I do so move. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.